Hello and welcome to Al-Arabiya News. I'm Joanne Syria. Before opposition forces toppled the government, Syria, a land of ancient history and cultural richness, was plunged into darkness for over a decade. What began in 2011 as peaceful protests was met with unimaginable brutality by Bashar al-Assad's regime, transforming the country into a battlefield. The toll has been devastating. More than 500,000 lives lost, millions displaced, and countless numbers of Syrians gone missing in the shadows of prisons and detention centers. Among these shadows, one of the most haunting revelations came from the Caesar files. This collection of tens of thousands of snapshots smuggled out of Syria by a defector by the name of Caesar exposed the systematic torture and killing of detainees in regime prisons. The images captured a stark reality: starved bodies, victims of brutal torture, and even children who were executed. Representing nearly 7,000 victims, these photos became undeniable evidence of crimes against humanity. But the Caesar files are more than just a collection of images. They revealed the depths of the Al-Assad regime's brutality and underscored the urgent need for accountability. Caesar risked his life to gather and smuggle this evidence, but he didn't work alone. Osama Uthman, known by his alias Sammy, was a close collaborator, helping to document and preserve these images at great personal risk. Together, they safeguarded evidence that not only brought global attention to the regime's atrocities, but also paved the way for the Caesar Act, a U.S. law imposing sanctions on the Al-Assad regime to limit its ability to continue its war against the Syrian people. As a crucial player in this effort, Sammy helped Caesar navigate the dangers of smuggling the files out of Syria. For Sammy, this wasn't just about exposing the regime's crimes. It was about justice, about giving a voice to the victims, and ensuring that their stories would not be buried. Al-Arabiya spoke to Sammy to hear his firsthand account of the risks, what happened along the way, and what he and Caesar had hoped to achieve. He also shares his thoughts on his home country after the fall of the Al-Assad regime. Sammy begins by reflecting on the significance of taking on a second name or identity during the uprising, like the names Sammy or Caesar, and explains the dangers faced by those in the revolution and how adopting a second name became a means of survival, not just a symbolic act.
During the revolution, every Syrian who was part of it gained a second name, born at different stages, perhaps early in the revolution itself. For example, before Osama Othman became Sami, my colleague, a defector, turned into Caesar. This duo's story began around early 2014. As I mentioned, this isn't just about Sami and Caesar, it's about all children of the Syrian revolution, each of whom had two names, one given by their mother at birth, and another bestowed by the revolution that gave them new life. Today, the two names have merged in a crucible of victory. When you call me Osama, I turn instinctively. When you call me Sami, I also instinctively respond. This phenomenon compelled us, and all Syrians in the revolution, to adopt shields to protect ourselves and our loved ones, stemming from a decision to bear the weight of this revolution, to protect others, family and loved ones who didn't make this choice, from a criminal regime that could retaliate cruelly, even against second or third degree relatives. We had to shield ourselves behind symbolic aliases. These risks have been borne by all Syrians who took part in the revolution. We're not detached from this reality. Our identities became intertwined with these symbolic names starting in early 2014. Sami's name, for instance, may have been born in a moment of choice, but Caesar's name was born twice. Caesar was born twice. The first time Caesar was born was when he escaped Damascus and left the country in a complex process.
Rooted in personal stories and moments that marked new beginnings, he recounts how the names Sammy and Caesar were chosen.
Initially, we approached this situation as a legal matter, an important case for human rights. Typically, the key witness in such cases is referred to as the Crown Witness. We deliberated for a long time over a name for this Crown Witness. someone suggested the name Caesar. I was also asked what name I'd like to use moving forward. I thought of my dearest friend I left behind in Syria and chose the name Sami. That's how Sami came to be. As for Caesar, as I mentioned, his birth occurred twice. First with his escape from Syria, but when it comes to the question, who is Caesar? I believe only Caesar himself can answer.
أعتقد أن هذا السؤال يجب أن يوجه إلى قيصر.
But why hasn't Caesar revealed his true identity? Sami attributes this to the persistent threat posed by the Syrian regime, questioning whether anyone can truly assert that it has come to an end.
المشكلة تتعلق
The issue lies with the number of people who might perceive you as a threat. While the Syrian regime was indeed a danger to us, who can definitively say that the regime has fallen? Can anyone today claim that the Syrian regime is over? The Syrian regime isn't just Bashar al-Assad. It's an entire system. Thousands have blood on their hands and have violated the rights and lives of Syrians. So I wouldn't say the danger has completely disappeared. That's why revealing Caesar's true identity is a decision I leave entirely to him. I respect that completely, and I promised him, when we left Syria, that I'd protect him until the very end.
While Sami describes his escape from Syria as rather normal, Caesar's escape was filled with risks.
As for me, I left the country in a normal matter. I wasn't personally wanted by the regime, so I left through normal channels, and the families were evacuated quietly. The last person to leave was Caesar, whose escape was complicated and fraught with risks. We enlisted the help of someone we knew who had experience with such operations. At the time, there was a former member of parliament from our city named Mohammed Bomo, if I recall correctly. The process took an entire month of attempts before it succeeded, during which Caesar faced numerous dangers. I've come to believe he's far braver than I initially thought. This marks Caesar's physical birth. The first birth, of course, was before he became Caesar. There's much information about the nature of our work, the technical details of the escape, and the process of documenting evidence. However, we're still cautious about disclosing these details. We presented testimonies before courts in France and Germany, and we must prevent these details from circulating in the media.
During the interview, Sami also addresses misconceptions about the Caesar files, clarifying the actual scale of the documentation and its importance. He went on to describe working with Caesar to document the atrocities.
كلمة 55,000 صورة ليست دقيقة.
The claim of 55,000 images is incorrect. It was about 27,000 snapshots, not images, because each corpse was photographed multiple times, 4, 5, or 6 shots, depending on the condition of the body and the injuries. Therefore, there were fewer than 7,000 victims of torture, and the figure of 55,000 is entirely inaccurate and not something we use. These images are part of the case file.
هذه الصور التي خرجنا بها هي جزء من الملف. توثيق الصور كان عملية شبه يومية.
Documenting the images was almost a daily process. My close friendship with Caesar as an old friend, as well as our very close family ties, played a role. In Syria, you cannot trust someone simply because they're a classmate, a childhood friend, or even a sibling. The regime turned everyone into a complex security threat, like something out of George Orwell's 1984. This long-standing relationship between Caesar and me enabled us to work together on a near-daily basis. Caesar would return from work almost every day and provide me with some of these images, which I would save on my devices and archive.
لكي أقوم بالاحتفاظ به على الأجهزة الموجودة لدي وأقوم بأرشفته. قيصر لا يسكن في مدينة أخرى وإنما.
I'd like to clarify that Caesar did not live in another city. He lived in the same city. I met with him almost daily, as I mentioned, and we exchanged flash drives or other storage devices. He frequently changed his methods due to the severe risks he faced while traveling from his residence to his workplace. He had to cross 2 areas with differing military control, making him vulnerable to targeting from both sides, either as a soldier working for the regime or as someone engaging in work that, if discovered, would result in a disaster for both him and me.
لو اكتشفه النظام لكانت هناك كارثة كبيرة عليه وعلي أيضا. اتبعنا الوسيلتين معا.
We used both methods to preserve the data, ensuring its safety in case we were targeted. The city we were in was invaded by the army, and computers we owned were confiscated multiple times. Fortunately, they had nothing significant on them. We felt a heavy responsibility, not just over our lives, but for safeguarding these files.
هي مسؤولية كبيرة لا تتعلق بحياتنا وموتنا فقط.
According to Sammy, very few people knew about their activities, adding that they had thought the revolution would end in just a few months.
لا طبعا أشخاص محدودين جدا هم الذين كانوا يعرفون بطبيعة ما يحصل بينهم.
Only a very limited number of people knew about what we were doing. At the beginning, we didn't plan to compile such dangerous files and smuggle them out of the country. We thought the revolution might end in 3 or 4 months, like in Egypt and Tunisia. We wanted to avoid the tragedy of 1982, where people went missing and no one knew whether they were dead or alive. So we decided to keep these images and, after the revolution, release them to the public so people could learn the fate of their loved ones, whether they'd been martyred or were missing.
نعلنها لشعبنا الكريم لكي يعرف الناس مصير أحبابهم من كان منهم قد استشهد ومن كان مفقودا حقيقة.
Sammy goes on to describe how these snapshots captured the horror of torture, highlighting what stood out the most.
الحقيقة لا أستطيع أن أقول عن صورة إنها بشعة.
Honestly, I cannot describe any of these images as horrifying. These are our martyrs, our people. We do not want to violate their privacy. You're talking about the horror of torture, the gruesome methods used. I cannot bring myself to compare or say one image shows more suffering or violation than another. However, what stood out was that some security branches consistently displayed severe starvation of detainees and victims, or instances where their eyes were gouged out. The thought of someone's eyes being ripped out while they were likely still alive, given the blood splatter around the eye socket, is haunting. I don't think you could ever see or experience a more horrible feeling than this.
هذا الأمر يعني عندما تتصوره لا أعتقد أنك يمكن أن ترى أو تعيش إحساس أبشع من هذا.
So who's the true hero here? According to Sammy, it's neither him nor Caesar.
مهما كانت الطريقة التي ينظر.
I just want to correct one thing. No matter how others perceive us, we are certainly not heroes. The true hero is the one who is martyred. It is the person in this photo. It is this file. This file is the hero. The real heroes are the mothers who lost their children, the wives and children who lost their fathers. They are the true heroes. We are merely carriers, messengers of justice, nothing more. At every stage of our work, the team would grow or shrink in number depending on the requirements of the phase, the location, and the goal we aim to achieve.
According to Sammy, there are several terms which he says are often confused when it comes to the Caesar files, adding that the Caesar Act was a byproduct of the files.
ابتداء أنا أريد التفريق بين مسميين.
First, I want to clarify the distinction between two terms that are often confused. The Caesar file pertains to victims who were killed in Syrian regime prisons under torture. These were defenseless civilians subjected to the most brutal forms of torture. The file itself has two other parts. The second part includes what the regime labels as terrorists, referring to people massacred in their homes, including children under the age of 10 and elderly individuals over 80. Yet the regime shamelessly labels these files as the elimination of a terrorist group, often claiming it consisted of 15 to 20 individuals. When you look at the photos, you see grandparents, parents, and small children. Shamelessly, the regime writes, the elimination of a terrorist group. This is the second part of the file. The third part is a collection of information that has not been revealed or discussed in the media. Together, these parts make up the Caesar file, which documents crimes against humanity and acts of genocide. These crimes do not expire with time, and no one has the right to waive accountability for the perpetrators. As for the Caesar Act, it's a byproduct of the file and a result of efforts by Syrian organizations in the United States. Our role in that effort was limited to a few visits to the US, where we met with members of Congress and other organizations and explained the atrocities committed by the regime against Syrian civilians. The distinction is clear. The file is purely Syrian, while the law is purely American. The overlap lies in their shared aim of protecting Syrian civilians and limiting the regime's ability to kill more of them.
الحد من قدرة النظام على أن يقتل أكثر من السوريين.
And describing the harrowing scenes he saw at regime prisons and centers, Sami says Al-Assad was running a killing factory.
What I can say is that the file I saw and compiled includes images of children. Yes, children. Why were they detained and killed? I cannot speculate. The brutality depicted in the photos is beyond imagination. It's unfathomable how the guards could carry out such horrific acts. What we've seen recently, with detainees being freed after prisons were opened by locals or authorities, represents perhaps the penultimate stage of producing these corpses, the victims of Bashar al-Assad's machinery of death. Al-Assad is running a factory of killing. The final stage is represented by the Caesar photos, where we noticed even the bodies were sometimes wrapped in nylon bags. Before that, during the initial detention and torture stages, I think what we have in the Caesar file is a very small part of the crimes that the regime was committing. The Caesar file only covers detention centers and prisons in Damascus, not all of Syria. It also spans a limited time period, from May 2011 to around August or September 2013.
تقريبا من الشهر الخامس 2011 إلى الثامن أو التاسع 2013.
While Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia, Sami calls for having the ousted president tried in Damascus by Syrian judges under a fair and just system in what he calls a free Syria.
عندما كنا نطالب
When we were calling for Bashar al-Assad to be brought to The Hague, Syria was occupied by his regime and its allies. It was a republic of fear. Despite the challenges, such as Russian and Chinese vetoes, we persisted. We turned to national courts in European Union countries that operate under universal jurisdiction. However, today Syria is free. Bashar al-Assad should be tried in Damascus by Syrian judges under a fair and just Syrian legal system. Justice should not stop with al-Assad. All of those who committed violations, whether physical or moral, must be held accountable. This must happen in Damascus as a symbol of justice for a free people who sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives.
Sami reveals to Al-Arabiya not all of those involved in the described crimes were only military personnel, but included doctors and others working in the medical field.
We have information about certain officers and staff working inside these prisons, including documents showing the involvement of a doctor who examined the victims' bodies and issued falsified medical reports. These reports often claimed victims died of a sudden cardiac arrest or respiratory failure during interrogation, even when their bodies bore horrific injuries such as missing eyes, severe burns, or extreme emaciation. We also have names and photos of some individuals involved, including those working in medical services in Damascus hospitals. Not all of them are military personnel.
يعني هم ليسوا عسكريين وإنما هم يعملون في الخدمات الطبية في مشافي دمشق.
During the interview, Sami calls on Syrians not to discard any documents they may find after the fall of the government. According to him, these could be used as evidence of the atrocities committed by the regime.
اليوم نحن نشاهد في دمشق وفي
What we see today in Damascus and other cities, how the archives are mishandled, is an affront to the victims' rights. We've seen documents carelessly discarded on the streets in Damascus and elsewhere. I want to remind Syrians that when Russia intervened in 2015, the revolution stagnated and the world turned away. The Caesar file isolated al-Assad economically and politically at a time when he was being rehabilitated internationally. Without it, he might now be walking red carpets in world capitals. So I urge Syrians not to discard these documents. They are critical. We have a team on the ground in Syria to collect what they can of these documents to aid us in the transitional justice period. How can you achieve transitional justice without accountability? Accountability requires evidence, and evidence depends on documents and accurate archiving. Documents handled carelessly may not be admissible in court.
ليست كل الوثائق يمكن قبولها في المحكمة إذا تم التعامل معها بهذه الطرق التي نشاهدها على الشاشات يوميا. هذا السؤال أستطيع أن أجيب عليه.
The chaos we see today in how documents are treated mirrors the disorganized release of detainees. Many of these detainees have spent decades in prison and are in poor health. Their treatment and the handling of documents must be systematic, as they are both part of the evidence. Additionally, any employee still serving under Bashar al-Assad's regime could tamper with or destroy critical documents. I urge people to be vigilant and ensure these individuals are not allowed to manipulate or destroy evidence.
فكيف نترك هؤلاء يتلفون هذه الوثائق ونعطيهم الوقت؟
Sami also reveals to Al-Arabiya that public hospitals in Syria turned into human slaughterhouses under the regime during the revolution years.
في سوريا جميع مؤسسات الدولة مهما كانت صفتها هي مؤسسات أمنية أو تخضع لإشراف أمني مباشر.
In Syria, all state institutions, regardless of their official function, are either security institutions or operate under direct security oversight. For instance, even at the level of municipal councils, there's a security officer monitoring every decision in detail. Public hospitals in Syria, which turned into human slaughterhouses during the revolution, became places where victims' and injured individuals' rights were grossly violated. While I cannot cite specific cases at this moment, this applies even more to branches of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, which routinely submitted reports to security agencies. These branches were not serving as political organizations, but as surveillance entities.
And moving on to the Caesar Act, Sami reiterates that his team's efforts were not focused on passing the law. Instead, they were able to prevent the regime from whitewashing its image.
I want to reiterate that our team's efforts were not focused on passing the Caesar Act. That was the work of Syrian organizations, achieved through a collective effort by many groups. Our real contribution lies in the emotional and legal impact that prevented the regime from rehabilitating its image. This regime is criminal, and the genuine legal testimonies we provided to institutions like the German public prosecutor and France's war crimes unit were instrumental. These testimonies formed the foundation of the legal cases heard in European courts. Unlike testimonies before parliaments, congresses, or political groups, these legal testimonies are enduring and impactful. Media testimonies may gain attention temporarily, but they do not hold the same weight or influence policy changes.
He also clarifies that the Caesar Act does not prevent the imports of essential goods, such as medication, as the regime had claimed.
Let me remind Syrians that the Caesar sanctions apply to all of Syria, not just areas under the regime's control. The dire situation in regime-controlled areas is not due to sanctions, but to the regime's corruption and economic mismanagement. The regime blames the Caesar Act for the lack of medicine and fuel, but this is untrue. The Caesar Act does not prevent the import of essential goods such as medicines, food, agricultural equipment, fertilizers or seeds. Its purpose is to limit the regime's ability to sustain its military machine used to kill Syrians. For example, the Deir Ali power plant south of Damascus receives Egyptian gas through a pipeline via Jordan, so fuel imports by sea are unnecessary. The regime's claims blaming sanctions are entirely false.
While the photos collected over the years played a significant role in holding the regime accountable, Sami reveals his and Caesar's original intentions.
لم يكن يطلع على هذا العمل سوى عدد محدود جدا من الأشخاص.
We collected these photos intending to share them with the Syrian people after the regime fell. At the time, we thought this would take only a few months. When we began, we had no plans to take these documents out of the country. Therefore, we never communicated with anyone outside the country or with individuals involved in legal affairs within the country, nor with those engaged in political affairs.
Sami explains the sensitive nature of handling the Caesar files, emphasizing the need to protect families from unnecessary trauma.
لم نكن جزء من هذا العمل.
We believed that handling the Caesar file required a professional and legal approach, not a sensational or haphazard one aimed directly at families in Syria. Many families who lost loved ones cannot even recognize their relatives in these images. For instance, I kept photos of friends for years without realizing they were people I knew. Only later did I discover that they were friends who had been tortured and killed. Due to the extreme disfigurement of the victims, it's neither appropriate nor humane to distribute these images indiscriminately. Showing such photos to families could cause repeated psychological trauma, especially if the person is not their missing relative. Similarly, families who recognize their loved ones may be unable to process the horror of what they see. This requires careful handling using legal and technical methods.
هذا الأمر يجب أن يعامل بحكمة وعبر وسائل تقنية وقانونية دقيقة.
Sami stresses that the regime's remnants still pose a challenge and that achieving freedom for Syria requires justice and accountability.
الذي سقط حتى الآن في رأينا هو بشار الأسد.
In our view, what has fallen so far is Bashar al-Assad himself, but his regime is not fully gone yet. There's still much work ahead of us to fully bring it down and be able to say that Syria has become free and that the last remnants of this regime, those who committed crimes against the Syrian people, have been eliminated. We are now part of Syrian human rights organizations operating in the European Union and the United States. Our work is ongoing and extends beyond the Caesar file. We've collected numerous other documents from inside Syria and expect to obtain more soon.
الوثائق التي حصلنا عليها حتى الآن من الداخل السوري والتي ربما نحصل عليها في القريب.
Sami reveals new findings, including previously unknown detention centers, as part of his team's ongoing work to uncover regime atrocities. He also describes how living under the regime felt like being in a prison where any interaction could lead to detention, torture, or worse.
We've obtained a portion of these documents which contain critical and dangerous information. We might acquire additional files that will complement our work, which goes far beyond the Caesar file. The Caesar file covers a limited period and geographic area. Today, we've identified previously unknown detention centers in Damascus, whose existence had never been publicly acknowledged. I can't claim certainty, but I can say that we have documents identifying prisons in Damascus whose names were previously unknown.
لا أستطيع أن أدعي ذلك ولكن
We're familiar with facilities like the Air Force Intelligence Branch, the Political Security Prison, Adra Prison, and Saidnaya Prison. Saidnaya in particular can be considered the Syrian Bastille, but this regime's crimes extend far beyond detaining people in conventional cells. For me, all of Syria was a prison. Walking the streets felt no different from being in a jail cell. While prisons might have low ceilings and locked doors, even those walking the streets were potential detainees at any moment. You might get into a taxi for a short trip, intending to pay 50 liras to reach your destination, but a casual or naive comment to the driver could redirect your path to a security branch or patrol station where you would pay for that ride with the rest of your life. I believe there's still much to uncover.
لكي تدفع ثمن هذا المشوار بقية عمرك.
While Syrians all over the world have been celebrating the fall of Al-Assad, Sami warns of what's to come if people truly believe that the entire regime had been toppled within days.
اسمح لي أن أقول أنه من السذاجة أن نعتقد بأن نظام عمره 60 عاما يمكن أن نقول إننا قضينا عليه في 6 أيام.
Let me say this, it's naive to think that a regime that has lasted for 60 years can be toppled in 6 days. Anyone making such claims insults the intelligence of the Syrian people. We've endured 3 generations under this oppressive and criminal regime, and every day we uncover thousands of documents revealing the extent of its crimes and the sadistic pleasure some of its operatives took in torturing and killing Syrians. Neither I nor anyone else can claim that this regime has truly fallen just because its head fled, or others raised a new flag. A green flag doesn't wipe the blood off anyone's hands. I cannot continue living in Syria while next door resides a man who reeks of bloodshed. I don't want to dampen the joy of our people in Syria, but I emphasize that to sustain this joy and stability, we must work towards transitional justice and accountability, not reconciliation. Reconciliation can be reserved for personal disputes and minor matters. No one reconciles over the blood of the people.
المصالحة في الخلافات الشخصية والأمور الصغيرة. لا أحد يصالح على دماء الناس. لا أقول أن هناك عمل مقصود لإعادة إنتاج النظام أبدا وإنما
I'm not suggesting there's a deliberate effort to revive the regime, but I caution our people in Syria and the heroes who expanded the Green Zone from Idlib, the capital of the revolution in recent years, to the south of Syria and Damascus itself. We must remain vigilant to ensure no one undermines our victory. We must systematically and meticulously work toward holding all perpetrators of violations accountable. This requires securing documents and removing former regime employees from positions of influence, regardless of the institutions they serve. However, I'm realistic. I can't advocate for expelling everyone from their positions. That's not feasible. But I urge our people on the ground and the heroes who liberated Damascus and other cities to prioritize this issue and handle it carefully.
على أن هذا أمر مهم يجب أن ينتبهوا إليه.
Finally, Sami reflects on his wish to have been in Damascus the day it was liberated.
أتمنى لو كنت في دمشق.
I wish I could have been in Damascus the day it was liberated. I wish I could have been in my hometown of Al-Tal on that day. I hope this moment comes very soon.
وأرجو أن يكون هذا الأمر قريبا جدا.
That was Sami's account, offering a rare and critical perspective into his journey and ongoing pursuit of justice for the victims of the Al-Assad regime. As the world watches and everyone waits to see what the future holds for this Middle Eastern country after an 11-year civil war. From Al-Arabiya News, I'm Joanne Syria. Thank you for watching.